Well, first I want to thank the association for inviting me. I truly feel honored to be in this program and to be with my fellow panelists. But before we get to speaking about the second generation, children of survivors, we have to talk about the context being the parents of these second generation individuals. So a little bit about Holocaust survivors and their post-war adjustment. First of all, let's keep in mind that when we see certain symptoms in Holocaust survivors, we can't necessarily assume that those symptoms are simply a result of their experiences during the Holocaust, because of course, Holocaust survivors, like any group, had a very pre-war personality, and that pre-war personality may have had a huge impact on how they cope with subsequent persecution. There are many, many factors, and I don't have time to go into all of them, that would determine, to some extent at least, how Holocaust survivors would adjust to a post-Holocaust life. I'll just quickly mention just 3 or 4 of them. First of all, the issue of how many other people from the individual's life also survived, that is, in particular, in his or her nuclear family. And that, of course, bears on the issue of survivor guilt. Not all Holocaust survivors experience survivor guilt. I would estimate that approximately, it's a rough estimation, approximately 50% of Holocaust survivors, I would say, experience survivor guilt. And again, a disproportionate number who experience guilt do so because all members of their immediate family were murdered. A lot of the post-war adjustment also has to involve the details of their experience. That is, in taking Holocaust testimony, one must ask follow-up questions all the time in order to get more and more detail. Let me give you a very good example of how that might impinge on the Holocaust survivors' post-war life. Some Holocaust survivors will tell you, well, you know, in the concentration camp, it was every man for himself. Oftentimes brother against brother, child against father for another scrap of bread, etc. Other Holocaust survivors will tell you, well, you know, in the concentration camp, I never would have survived if it wasn't for my fellow inmate, Yaakov, because Yaakov worked in the kitchen, and he was able to get a few extra scraps of food, which kept him and me alive because he was willing to share that bounty with me. Now, this is not a small thing, and it's not a small thing for many reasons, one of which would be, in his post-war life, the first Holocaust survivor would continue to see the world as a dog-eat-dog proposition. The second Holocaust survivor, who I just described to you, might still hold some faith in humanity. That is, this person could say to himself and to others, you know, in the darkest period of the concentration camp, there was a light. There were people who were still able to maintain their sense of humanity and empathy for their fellow human being. And of course, this is no small thing. If you look at the group of Holocaust survivors, they're a pretty cynical bunch. One Holocaust survivor, a patient of mine a few years ago, turned to me at one point and said, you know, Dr. Haas, you know what the world learned from the Holocaust? What the world learned from the Holocaust is that you can kill 6 million Jews and no one will care. Now, I mention him, and again, because I think he is very representative of the Holocaust survivor community. We talk about PTSD here, and again, not all Holocaust survivors should be diagnosed with PTSD, but in my travels across the United States and even elsewhere, but sticking for the moment to the United States, I've often been invited to speak at synagogues. And at the end of my lecture, I might ask the audience, and again, this is a synagogue-going audience, how many of you think another Holocaust could occur? Now, if this is an audience of Jews who had no contact with the Holocaust, approximately 10% might raise their hand. When I'm speaking to a large group of Holocaust survivors and I ask the same question, how many of you think another Holocaust could occur? 80 to 90% will raise their hand. And indeed, if you try to discuss with them or even argue with them, oh, come on, this is a different time, this is America, etc., they'll look at you and smile and think, boy, are you naive. Like most trauma victims, these individuals, these Holocaust survivors, anticipate future victimization. So this issue of what was their experience during the concentration camp is very important. If I simply knew that Mr. Samuels was in a concentration camp for 2 years and even knew which concentration camp he was in, it doesn't necessarily tell me what the effects might be. Another couple factors that are terribly important that people don't think about very much, and that is how much happiness do Holocaust survivors derive post-Holocaust? That is, some are so disabled that they're unable to derive much satisfaction, much happiness from their post-war life, and others are. And as you might imagine, that has a significant impact on their post-war adjustment. Now, in connection with this, and what I'm going to get to a little bit later in my lecture, has to do with their children. There is a phrase in Yiddish, nachas. Now, what does nachas mean? Nachas means deriving some satisfaction or happiness, nachas von de Kinder, from the children. So if a Holocaust survivor has a post-war family, has a couple of kids, and they do, quote, do well, he's much more likely going to be a happy individual than if he, post-Holocaust years, has a child, has a family that is terribly problematic. So again, when we see this Holocaust survivor who's an unhappy person, perhaps a depressed person, a highly anxious person, we should not assume that this is simply or even significantly a result of their Holocaust experience. Survivor guilt is a big issue, and I wish I had a half an hour to just talk about who's more likely to experience survivor guilt than other individuals. In one of the earlier lectures, one of the individuals spoke about survivor guilt and spoke about PTSD in the context of who's more educated or who is better equipped to deal with the persecution of the Armenian genocide. In my own studies, education has nothing to do with it. In fact, if Holocaust survivors are being honest with you, they will tell you, as they've told me on multiple occasions, you know, Dr. Haas, the best did not survive. The intellectuals didn't survive because they couldn't imagine that a Germany of Goethe and Schiller and Heine could engage in such atrocities. The most sensitive didn't survive because they couldn't withstand the rigors of the physical rigors, the emotional rigors of a prolonged and protracted persecution. The most pious did not survive because they placed their fate in the hands of God, and that passivity doomed them. So even on a more personal level, how many times did I hear, my brother, David, he was the good kid. He was the kid who went to yeshiva, studied hard, was the sweetest kid, helped my parents, helped his grandparents whenever he could. Me, I was the kid who got in trouble all the time. I was the kid who cut school. Why did I survive? Why me? A personal anecdote. I'll take a moment. Several years ago, I was in Poland. I had some negotiations with the Polish government on behalf of an organization I was involved with called the Holocaust Sites Preservation Committee. It was our committee that undertook the task of taking care of concentration camp sites in Poland that were not being taken care of by the Polish government. In any case, I was invited by a professor of history at Warsaw University to tour the death camp Treblinka, which is about an hour's ride outside of Warsaw. And so he took me, and he was also the curator of the museum at Treblinka. And so he drove me out there, and showed me around the camp. There's virtually nothing left there. The Germans set fire to the entire camp in order to try to eliminate any traces of what took place there. But in any case, he showed me around, and then at some point I knew I didn't have much time left, so I asked him if I could meet him back at the car. I really wanted to walk around that site by myself. Walked around for a while, and if any of you have ever been there, you know that the railway line that brought Jews to the gas chambers is really very close to the gas chambers, and it's called the path of death that goes from that train rail to the gas chamber. Anyway, I went over to the railroad tracks, and I just sat down with my legs dangling over the tracks, and I was looking around and trying to imagine what took place there 50 years before. And I was immersed in my own thoughts, and after a while I saw that my host was signaling to me that it was sort of time to go. And I started to get up, and I found that I couldn't. I literally couldn't get up. And I had the simultaneous thought, what right do I have to leave this place when 900,000 Jewish men and women and children could not? I'd never had a thought like that before in my life. It was, completely spontaneous. And again, I think just a very good example of an aspect of second generation that deals with survivor guilt, and also, as I'll get to a little bit later on, just feelings of entitlement, or the lack of feelings of entitlement. So, the Holocaust survivor family. Approximately a third of Holocaust survivors spoke a great deal about their experiences to their children. Another third did not speak at all to their children about their experiences. And another third tended to tell their children the same stories over and over again. It seems as though those are the stories, those are the events that the Holocaust survivor has been able to process to some extent, and stories that because they're repeated over and over, do not provide as much upset, as much of an emotional reaction as new material might. There's also another aspect that's very interesting about Holocaust survivors, and that is the aspect of secrecy. There are many Holocaust survivors who had pre-war families and who did not tell their post-war family about it. And I wanted to just really quickly read to you a relevant excerpt from an interview I conducted bearing on this issue. Typically, they, Holocaust survivors, did not discover the existence of a predecessor until adolescence or young adulthood. David Himmelstein feels guilty about replacing his first and second born who were taken from him. Children are not easily replaced. Furthermore, to enjoy his post-Holocaust children, or to enjoy any aspect of life for that matter, would feel like another betrayal of the two daughters he was unable to protect. And here's a quote from Mr. Himmelstein. You see, you loved so much your own children that you're afraid to love so much as you did before. Not to make jealous the dead children. Like they're saying, you had two children and you lost them in the gas. Don't be too happy. So, coming from the experiences they had in recent years, before the end of the Holocaust, not surprisingly, one of the things that characterizes most Holocaust survivor families is the fact that Holocaust survivors are overly protective of their children. Part of that is an attempt to regain some sense of control over being able to provide safety for their children. So many feel on a very conscious level that that unfortunately they weren't able to intervene, they weren't able to protect, they weren't able to ensure the survival of those most dear to them. Another very common theme in terms of survivors and their children is the difficulty that children of survivors had separating from parents, not just physically now, but I also mean psychologically. And parents very much contributed to this. That is, keep in mind who was most likely to survive. It was individuals who were teenagers or young adults, because young children, older adults, they were killed first because they were deemed of no use to the German factories or German slave labor. And so survivors did not have an opportunity to experience firsthand the normal separation, the normal psychological separation that needs to take place between parent and child. And when a child would try to separate emotionally, they would be met with resistance, and if not more than resistance, a blatant appeal to guilt. How could you do this to me after all I've experienced? And that, of course, is unfortunately, a very common refrain, and it keeps children of Holocaust survivors from, again, expressing the normal feelings of rebellion, the normal feelings of I need to seek some independence apart from the family, and particularly in families that are rife with anxiety, with depression, with a cynical view of the world. This is, again, not a small thing. One of the things that infects children from survivors is that cynical view of the world. It's not only survivors who see the world in a particular way, but it's their children as well. One of the more common features of children of survivors is a certain degree of anxiety, a certain degree of, as I said before, mistrust of the world. I grew up in a home, and in this sense, a very typical home, where the world was divided into two. There were Jews and there were non-Jews. And the non-Jews were referred to as Goyim. Goyim is a derogatory Yiddish word for Gentiles. And the word Goyim is used by survivors because, again, of how they view non-Jews. That is, for survivors, the Holocaust was not a single event in the persecution of the Jewish people at the hands of Gentiles. And so once again, any Jew who thinks that Holocaust won't occur, not only is looked at naively, but it has to be reminded, wait, you think it began with the Holocaust? What? I mean, the Inquisition, the charges of deicide. When I was growing up in Poland, my parents were Polish. When I was growing up in Poland, Jews didn't walk out of their house on Easter. Jews didn't walk out of their house on Christmas Eve because you knew you were going to be accosted by the Goyim. And so, again, there is this worldview of continued and prolonged hostility, which only culminated in mass murder. Again, I just want to read to you a couple of very brief excerpts. This from a patient of mine, a child of Holocaust survivors. Jewish suffering as a genre was held up to me as an implicit diminution of my own personal pain. In other words, the equation was, how can you complain in the face of so much real suffering? The result was a home in which the child's psyche was overlooked or belittled, and it created an environment in which I was unwilling to articulate my subjective pain about certain episodes in life. In other words, for the Holocaust survivor, nothing could compare to suffering during the Holocaust. So how could one ask for not just empathy, but how could one ask for any sort of compensatory response. Again, quoting, "Their experience invalidated anything I was upset about. Whatever I was feeling didn't count, because if I had pain, they didn't want to hurt. So to shut off their pain, they would tell me it didn't really hurt or I was being silly. They could not whatsoever relate to the problems of an American adolescent, boyfriends, dating, because theirs was spent in concentration camps. For example, if I was upset about a boy, my mother would berate me for it being such an insignificant problem. After all, I had food, clothing, a home, and I had my parents. My parents never discussed feelings. They can't cope with their kids being anything less than extremely happy and successful." And one of the reasons they can't acknowledge any of that is because psychologically that would be another victory for Hitler. That is, that would be an indication that Hitler's tentacles had reached even beyond Jewish individuals caught up in the Holocaust, but in their offspring post-Holocaust. How am I doing? Okay.
Thank you.
So, children and survivors, who talked, how did that discussion go? Mostly children and survivors never asked their parents about their experiences for a variety of reasons. For example, they were afraid that it would cause more pain for their parents if they were to ask. But oftentimes these children weren't even aware of their own fears in asking about their parents' experiences. It's very interesting to me that so many of the children of survivors I encountered really knew virtually nothing about their parents' experience. And when that was the case, oftentimes they filled in that void with their fantasies of what their parents experienced, and sometimes their fantasies were even worse than the reality. Also, you might have thought that children of Holocaust survivors know a lot about the Holocaust. They don't. For the most part, children of Holocaust survivors know very little, and yet they think they know a lot about the Holocaust. Why? Because they've known firsthand the emotional reaction of their parents. But if you ask a typical Holocaust survivor, a child of Holocaust survivors, what took place at the Wannsee Conference, they wouldn't know. Again, a very seminal event in the creation of the strategy of the Nazi regime. Despite the fact that most children of survivors don't know a great deal about their parents' experiences, nevertheless, all children of Holocaust survivors grew up knowing that something horrible had happened to their family. One obvious sign of that in my own life and in many other children's lives. I didn't have any grandparents. I was the only kid in my group who didn't have any grandparents. There are other things like that, but that was a very stark and a very dramatic absence, given the fact that all my friends growing up had grandparents. That was sort of normal. What else is important for me to say? Okay, good. I was asked to speak about the strengths of children of survivors as well. So many Holocaust survivors themselves, despite their ongoing feelings of vulnerability, despite their anticipation of another Holocaust, will tell you, I survived Auschwitz. I can survive anything. And that mentality was was also adopted by many children of survivors. That is, many children of survivors view their parents as an inspiration. They may also view them as damaged, but as is often the case with human beings who have complexities to them, at the same time that they see their parents as vulnerable and overly anxious, they can also appreciate that not only do they survive, but in many ways they thrive. And I'm also reminded, if you met a typical Holocaust survivor, you would not know he or she was a Holocaust survivor, other than his accent or her accent. That survival is social, convivial, able to joke around, able to enjoy milestone events in his child's life and his grandchild's life, although while his child is under the wedding canopy, he's likely to have a thought like, gee, I wish my mother or my father could be here to see this. But nevertheless, he's not sitting, outside, mourning all the time, unable to have a social life, unable to enjoy himself. That's not your typical Holocaust survivor. And I remember years ago, there was a conference at UCLA about Holocaust survivors. And after my lecture, some of you may know the name Professor Shaul Friedlander, really a preeminent Holocaust scholar who used to teach at UCLA. And he was also a child Holocaust survivor. And at the end of my lecture, he raised his hand, sitting the first time, he said, well, Professor Haas, where is the anger? Where is the anger? And I thought about it for a moment. I said, well, the anger is manifested in the impatience of the Holocaust survivor. The anger is manifested in his cynical view of man. The anger is manifested in the fact that behind closed doors, when he goes home, he can be explosive towards his spouse, his children, but not outside the home. And so, we have to understand there's a public Holocaust survivor and a private Holocaust survivor. Let me just make one other point before I end. Those of us who spend a good deal of our life, like our panelists, interviewing survivors of genocide, know that it can take a toll. It can take a toll on the interviewer. And sometimes it can make us question, why are we doing this? Is it worth it? I remember once at the very end of a difficult interview I had with a Holocaust survivor. When I say difficult, I mean someone who had never spoken about her experiences before. Someone who, during the interview, broke down on many an occasion. Each time I would ask if she wanted to continue, she said absolutely. And at the end of the interview, I felt badly. I mean, I seemed to have caused this woman considerable pain. And so I apologized to her. I said, I'm really sorry, Sarah. I'm really sorry for, the pain that you've experienced this afternoon. And she said to me, Dr. Haas, don't be sorry. Finally, somebody asked. Finally, somebody wanted to know. And I'll be forever grateful to you for that. And that was, as you might imagine, terribly important for me to hear. Not just for, that she got something out of the interview, but that she was grateful. And so many Holocaust survivors will tell you about their bitterness, that after they came to this country, nobody asked. Nobody seemed to care. And American Jews justified their not asking, justified to themselves by saying, well, I don't want to cause them any pain, right? I'm sure they went through some terrible things, but I don't want to have them go through terrible memories. Not understanding that these survivors wanted their experiences to be known. wanted others to know about their losses. And I think I'll stop at this point, and I know I was asked to speak about psychotherapy and children of survivors and survivors, and I'm happy to do that somewhat in the Q&A if people are interested in that. But I think I'll leave it right there.